Welcome to Evidence and Answers, where we provide compelling evidence for faith and hope in Christ and biblical answers to the issues of today. Well, we've been doing a series on the Israel and Hamas conflict. There have been a lot of questions asked regarding this situation, and it's been great to have completed a four-part series. This is part 5 here. And before I begin, some of you have been asking, you've been seeing the shirts I've been wearing here on YouTube and asking pretty cool looking Evidence and Answers shirts here. Where can I get a copy? Well, go to our website at evidenceandanswers.org, and we have a very limited supply of these great polo shirts with the Evidence and Answers logo that you can order. And as well, some of you have been seeing my coffee mug here with our logo. You can also go to the website and order some of our material. And if you're having trouble, then just shoot me an email at pat@evidenceandanswers.org. Well, we have been covering the Israel and Hamas conflict, and I hope it's been helpful because we've been looking at it from more than just a geopolitical view. We've been also looking at it through a biblical lens. And one of the things, of course, we emphasize here is that Christianity is an all-embracing worldview. And so the things that are going on in the world and the events that are going on, we need to look at it more than just through a geopolitical lens, but also through the framework of a biblical worldview. Well, in this 5th video, we're going to cover the topic of terrorism and just war. There's a lot of confusion over this issue between terrorism and just war. Recently we have seen protesters accusing Israel of terrorism and genocide. In a recent report, the U.S. News and World Report stated that even Pope Francis said the conflict had gone beyond war. The report states that the Pope said, "This is what wars do, but here we have gone beyond wars. This is not war, this is terrorism." And if I understand the quote in its context, I think at this point, the Pope is accusing both sides, Hamas and Israel, of terrorism. And as we see the number of casualties growing in Gaza, we're hearing more and more accusations from worldwide communities against Israel that they are committing acts of terrorism. Now, many are confused when it comes to terrorism and just war. Is there a difference between the two? Many of us have heard that statement, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Who has a just cause in this situation? Or are both sides involved in unjust acts of terrorism? Well, I can tell you there's a difference between just war and terrorism. There are times when the use of force by a particular country is indeed justified. And in a fallen world, evil does exist, and there are ideologies that are evil and individuals and groups that commit acts of evil. So when nations or organizations commit acts of evil, it is just and even necessary to use force. So there is a definite difference between acts of terrorism and the just use of force. So I hope in this particular video to bring some clarity when it comes to this whole issue of terrorism and just war. It's critical that we understand this issue, and especially we as believers in Christ can articulate the difference between the two when we encounter situations like this going on in the world. Now, the Bible teaches there are times when the use of force is justified. There's several passages that God ordained government and gave government the authority to execute justice. In Genesis 9, verses 5 through 6, this is after Noah has come out of the ark. God says here, "And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast, I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." Now, many Bible scholars call this particular passage the establishment or the dispensation of government here. There are three institutions established by God. One, of course, is marriage. That is institution established and created by God. And so on a side note here, we redefine marriage at our own peril, because the institution of marriage is not a man-made cultural construct. It is an institution created by God, and we change the definition of marriage at our own peril. Civilizations that have redefined marriage, going against God's established plan for this institution, do so at their own peril. Another institution that God has established in the New Testament is the church. Of course, the third one is government. And in this passage, God ordains the institution of government to carry out justice. In this case, a just sentence on murder is the death penalty. In Exodus 21, in the Old Testament law, God states this: when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Here God taught that if the life of a child in the womb is lost, the guilty party will suffer the penalty of death. Here is a just punishment for the taking of life is a life. And getting on a side note here, notice God considers life in the womb. The embryo in the womb is a life. And so when that life is taken, then the guilty party, their life is required as just punishment here. Romans 13, verses 1 through 4 in the New Testament, Paul writes this: let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So one of the roles of government is to execute justice here. And just governments, abiding by the moral laws of God, are ordained to execute justice here. And Paul says here, for he does, speaking of government, for government does not bear the sword in vain. The term sword there is the ability to take life. It has been delegated to government to execute justice. So in this passage, Paul teaches human government has been given the authority of the sword. And when it is necessary, governments are allowed to take life, to execute justice as they stand against evil. Now notice, that authority is given to governments, not the church, not to individuals, or not to groups, right? So I, as an individual, if I feel injustice was done to me, I can take vengeance in my own hands. No, that is to be tried in a legal court, and then justice is to be executed by the government, right? Now, there are also several times in the Old Testament, God commands Israel to go to battle. And in fact, God even intervenes in the conflict to bring Israel victory. For example, in the Old Testament, God commands Israel to go to war. Joshua 6, he orders Joshua as an instrument of God's discipline upon nations that have gone against God's law and no longer able to be redeemed. God commanded Israel to destroy the city of Jericho. And if you read the chapter, it is the Lord himself who had a hand in bringing down the walls of Jericho so the people of Israel could go and attack and conquer the city. In Joshua chapter 10, God commanded Joshua to destroy the Amorites for the evil that they had been committing for generations. And in that battle, God even caused the sun to stand still. God's hand was directly involved, so Joshua and the Israelites could wipe out the Amorites. In 1 Samuel verse 23, the Philistines attacked the city of Keilah, and David inquired of the Lord there in chapter 23 and verse 2. And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." So God ordained David to use force in the defense of the city of Keilah. Psalm 44, it's a psalm praising God, and in the opening verses, this is what the psalmist writes. "O Lord, we have heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days. In the days of old, you, with your own hand, drove out the nations, but then you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but then you set free. For not by their own sword did they win the land, nor did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm and the light of your face, for you delighted in them." So the psalmist states here, it's not the sword of Israel that brought victory to the nation, but actually it was the Lord who defeated Israel's enemies. It's because he was with them, Israel was able to wipe out their enemies. Israel was victorious in battle because the Lord actively fought against the enemies of Israel here. And in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist is preaching to repent and get right with God because the King of the kingdom is coming. And people come and say, "What must we do then?" And in verse 14, Roman soldiers come to John the Baptist and ask John the Baptist, "And we, what shall we do?" And John the Baptist said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages." Notice, John the Baptist does not tell the soldiers to leave the army or that any use of military force is wrong. He tells them to do not extort money and to act justly and be content with their wages. And in Revelation 19, when Christ comes to establish his kingdom here upon the earth, he must do so by making war upon the nations. Christ returns with the heavenly hosts to do battle against the nations of the world in rebellion against him. Notice, Christ himself must defeat evil through war. So if the Prince of Peace must defeat evil through warfare, we can expect military force will be needed to be used against forces of evil in this age. So it's important we have a good understanding, the biblical principles of when it is just to use force. Now, there are several biblical principles in the use of force. First, the use of force or war in the defense of the innocent is just. In the Bible, Israel was called to war by God to defend her land against invading forces several times. Once Israel was established in the Promised Land, Israel had the right to defend herself, and God was often involved in the defense of Israel from her enemies. And in modern times, from 1939 to 1942, Germany invaded and occupied the nations of Europe. The European nations then were justified in defending themselves from the Nazi forces. And when the Allies finally turned the tide of the war, Only a full defeat of Hitler and the Nazi military would restore peace to the world. So war in defense of the innocent is just. If a country aggressively attacks civilians of another nation or aggressively attacks them for the purpose of economic gain or attaining land and resources, that would be an unjust war. But a just war in defense of its people and its nation is indeed justified. Second, wars fought to execute justice are just. Often you can't bring an enemy force to justice in your courts. Instead, you must bring justice to them. So wars fought to execute justice are just. For example, in Genesis chapter 14, we have an alliance of kings from Mesopotamia that invaded the Jordan Valley, conquered the cities, and took the treasures from the conquered cities along with hostages for slavery. And some of these hostages included Abraham's nephew, Lot. Abraham then, under the guidance of the Lord, he attacked, he chased down these kings there in the Jordan Valley, caught them way up in the northern Jordan Valley there. His attack was to rescue his nephew Lot and execute justice on the invading kings. Justice demands punishment fit for the crime, and nations engaged in criminal activity against another country are subject then to attack. However, the invading country, once they are victorious, does not have the right to occupy permanently. Really, the moral duty is to restore the country's independence once the enemy is subdued. And you saw that when the United States defeated Germany and Japan, they did not sit there and occupy the country. Instead, they helped rebuild the country and then eventually allowed the country to be an independent country again. We've seen that in Japan, in Germany, in the Philippines, and in numerous other countries. So, wars fought to execute justice are just. Third, a just war must be fought by a government. Romans 13:4 says that God gave the power of the sword to governments and not individuals or groups of individuals. God gave the sword to establish governments. They are the ones that can execute justice, who can declare and wage war on an enemy nation. So wars must be declared by a country in order for it to be just. Fourth, a just war must be fought justly. Targets should be military combatants, not civilians or innocent women or children. And we see several guidelines, even in the Bible, when Israel attacked a particular city. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says to offer terms of peace, and if they do not surrender, then they can attack the city when ordered by God. And in verse 19, the Bible says this, when you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it, in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? Only the trees that you know are not trees for food you may destroy and cut down, that you may build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it falls. So there were guidelines there even for battle. They were not just to come in and just completely devastate the land and burn everything down. God commands the Israelites here not to use trees that have fruit for military purposes. God said trees that don't bear fruit, you can use them to build military equipment, but the trees that bear fruit, to leave them alone. Israel was not to destroy the land's capacity to sustain its people after the battle was over. So after Israel was victorious, the people of the city needed a way to sustain themselves. And so that's why Israel was commanded not to touch the trees that bear fruit. So the just war must be fought justly. One of the main guidelines is that civilian casualty is to be avoided as much as possible. Your primary target should be military targets and military combatants. Those are some of the principles and guidelines for a just war. Now, further developing this is Augustine's just war doctrine. This was developed and formalized by the great Augustine there in the 4th century AD. For those of you who aren't familiar with Augustine, he is one of the greatest philosophers and theologians, not only in church history, but in all of Western history. If you study classical philosophy, you should read the works of Augustine. That is just how great and important of a figure he is. And even way back there, over 1,000 years ago, his doctrine of just war has been used and followed even to this day, right? So what are Augustine's principles of just war? Well, first, there must be a just cause. And the just cause primarily is to protect one's homeland. So just wars are fought on defensive or preventative wars. Those are indeed just, right? So when you are attacked or there is a threat of attack upon your country and upon your people, it is just to use a military force to protect your homeland. And sometimes that means going into the other country and defeating the enemy to establish peace. Second, there must be just intention. The intention of going to battle is to secure peace, never revenge or conquest to gain territory or economic gain or exploit the resources of another country. It's to secure peace, to defeat the enemy force and restore peace to the land and to the nation, to the world, right? So just intention to secure peace. Third, war must be a last resort when all other means fail, right? Economic boycott, negotiations, when all of that fails and that enemy still insists on invading or using military force against another country, a war is the last resort when all other means fails. Fourth, there must be a formal declaration of war. Since the use of military force, that right is given to human governments. Remember Romans chapter 13. It's government that has the authority to bear the swords, not private groups or individuals. So a state of war must be declared by the highest authorities, by governments. They must declare war on the other nation there. And if the other nation does not surrender or come to the negotiation table, then as a last resort, the declaration is given, and then the country is justified in going to war. Fifth, there must be limited objectives, right? You're there to defeat the enemy and establish peace. You're not there to completely wipe out the people, destroy the culture, and burn down all that there is in the land. Excessive force is not to be used. Limited objective, military targets, defeating the enemy, all right? 6, there must be only a use of force that is proportionate to attain victory, right? You're not there to completely destroy the country. You want to use enough force to attain victory, and that is it, all right? 7th, civilian casualty must be avoided. Military combatants and military bases are the targets. civilian casualty is to be avoided as much as possible. Now, in a war situation, it's not always possible to not have any civilian casualties. And unfortunately, the ethics by which Hamas fights, they use civilians as shields. And so it's going to be really tough not to have civilian casualties. But the United States spends billions of dollars, right, creating advanced technology. For example, missiles using laser technology so we can precisely hit the target, the military target we're looking at, with the least amount of collateral damage as possible, right? Well, let's take a look at terrorism here. Terrorism defined is the use of fear and violence against innocent civilians, right? Not against military combatants or military bases. It's the use of fear and violence against innocent civilians in an attempt to influence public opinion and policy. That's the definition of terrorism. So terrorists usually do harm to civilians, non-combatants, in an effort to create societal fear. Now, we're going to look at terrorism and just war, all right? And the difference is this. When it comes to terrorism, you just take the principles of just war that we just went over and you just turn them upside down and you get terrorism, all right? So comparing terrorism and just war, let's take a look here. In just war, the goal is to protect the innocent versus terrorism, which is to strike terror. On October 7th, Hamas launched a large-scale surprise attack on unarmed civilians in Israeli territory. And if you read the reports there and you saw some of the videos, Hamas burned people alive, cut off heads, raped women, and mutilated bodies of civilians. So these gruesome acts were not done to protect their homeland of Gaza, but to strike fear and terror on the people of Israel so that they would have a position to make demands. And we're seeing their demands now. Israel's response, on the other hand, was to protect their civilians from Hamas. So between just war and terrorism, it's in just war you're there to protect, versus in terrorism it's to strike terror into the opposition. Second, just war is meant to secure peace, while terrorism, their goal is to cause fear. The attack by Hamas there on October 7th was not to bring peace. Anything, it was to strike fear through their acts of violence. It was not an act of peace, it was a clear disruption of peace. Israel now seeks to destroy Hamas for the purpose of bringing peace to the land. Hamas has proven over the last several decades to be a terrorist organization, and their goal, which they clearly state in the Hamas government and in their symbols, and if you hear the speeches of their leaders, is the destruction of Israel. And peace will not come to the land unless this group, its leaders and its ideology, is brought to an end. And unfortunately, you're going to have to use military force to make that possible. Third, in a just war, the use of force is the last resort after all else fails. While in terrorism, you first strike and then make your demands. Hamas, as we all witnessed, launched a surprise attack, killed thousands of Israelis, took over 1,400 hostages, and then started making their demands. And Hamas used the hostages not only for their own protection, but also to make demands, specifically the release of many Hamas combatants from Israeli prisons. You see the prisoner swap going on here. Israel is releasing many people who committed acts of violence against the nation of Israel back to Hamas. Israel, on the other hand, the use of force was the last resort for Israel. Because they had been attacked like this, then force was necessary. And you look at the hostages being released by Hamas. We've seen over 80 of them now. Who are they? Women, children, elderly women, and infants even. Children and elderly adults. You look at the hostages being released by Israel. They are not children and elderly men and women, but adults who have committed acts of terror. Fourth, in just war, there is a formal declaration given by governments, whereas in terrorism, it is all about surprise. There is no formal declaration given. On October 7th, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel with no formal declaration or a warning. So Israel, in response, warned the civilians in northern Gaza, dropping thousands of leaflets in northern Gaza, warning the people there, we are coming to take out Hamas. So get out of northern Gaza, flee to the south. And they were given, the Gaza people were given time to escape northern Gaza and flee to the south, even though that provided an advantage to Hamas. They knew where Israel was going to attack, and approximately they knew that they had some time, if they wanted to get some of their men out of northern Gaza into southern Gaza there. And so although it provided Hamas some advantage, Israel gave a formal declaration and a warning to the civilians in northern Gaza to get out. Fifth, its limited objectives versus destruction of a nation. The Hamas mission, it's clearly stated if you read their material, but the Hamas mission is the annihilation of the Jewish people. Their goal is clearly seen in their logo. If you look at their logo, the entire land of Palestine, there at the top of their logo, the entire land of Palestine is in green, the color of Hamas. This reveals their goal, which is removal of the Jews from Israel and bringing all of Palestine under the Islamic rule of Hamas. There is no compromise. There is no room for a two-state solution. Their goal is the complete removal of the Jews from the land of Israel. Their desire for the complete destruction of Israel is also seen in the Hamas covenant, and you can read this covenant there on the internet. It's readily available, and you can see what their mission and their goal is. In the introduction of the Hamas covenant, it states, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Article 7 of the Hamas covenant states, nevertheless, the Islamic resistance movement aspires to bring the promise of Allah to pass, no matter how long it takes. As the Prophet Muhammad made a prayer of Allah and his blessing of peace be upon him said, the time Judgment Day will not come until Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, until the Jew hides behind the rocks and trees. And then the rocks and trees will say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him. Except for the salt bush tree, so it is the tree of the Jews. And they are quoting a passage from the Hadith. It's one of the most reliable collections of Al-Bukhari there, Muslim 26 there. And so in the Hamas covenant, it reveals the desire of Hamas is not victory over the Jews, but complete annihilation and destruction of the Jews, complete removal of the Jews from the land of Palestine. That's why it's so difficult. They will not accept a two-state solution. That's why a two-state solution hasn't worked with groups like Hamas, whose goal, clearly stated, is the destruction of the nation of Israel. Israel, on the other hand, seeks the end of Hamas, not destruction of Gaza or wiping out the Palestinian people. In fact, Israel warned the Gaza civilians in the north that they will be attacking northern Gaza, the stronghold of Hamas. They've made their goal clear. It's to destroy this terrorist organization, Hamas, not wiping out or the annihilation of the Palestinian people. Their goal is the defeat of Hamas. And as I've made it clear several times in this series, Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Most Palestinians are peace-loving, peaceful people. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and they do not represent the ideology of most of the Palestinian people. 6. Only appropriate force is used in just war versus in terrorism, the largest amount of damage possible is the goal. So Hamas attacked areas where there were crowds gathered, like those going to the concert. Israel, on the other hand, like the United States, is using precision-guided rockets and seeking to take out Hamas military targets and military combatants. And they're doing the best that they can targeting military targets and military combatants. 7th, in just war, civilian casualty is to be avoided, versus in terrorism, civilians are the target. And we see Hamas, they clearly attacked civilians. And you look amongst their prisoners are babies, infants, elderly men, and women. And even now, Hamas is using civilians as shields and fighting from hospitals, schools, and religious centers. If you look at the documentaries and footage coming out, Israel has discovered tunnels and ammunition stored in hospitals and elementary schools and religious centers. And many of the hostages report that they were in those tunnels used to prevent Israel from attacking the militants who are hiding there and the ammunition that was stored there. So as much as Israel tries to avoid civilian casualties, it'll be very, very difficult because Hamas uses civilians as human shields. So it's very difficult for Israel to avoid at many times civilian casualties the way Hamas is doing battle there. And Israel warned non-combatants before they invaded to get out of northern Gaza and to flee to the south. And despite the advantage this gave Hamas, Israel dropped thousands of leaflets into northern Gaza warning the people. But in terrorism, civilians are the target. In just war, they try to target military targets and military combatants. And as I said, because Hamas uses civilians as human shields and protection, that's a very unethical way to fight, but it's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult. Israel has some very difficult choices to make in attacking some of these military targets, and so they're going to have to use a lot of wisdom and discernment there. And unfortunately, doesn't look like they'll be able to completely avoid civilian casualties the way Hamas is doing battle. So they're not on the, fighting on the same moral grounds here. And as you can see, Hamas and Israel are not fighting on the same moral ground here. So I hope you see that there is a difference in this battle here between just war and terrorism here. Well, how do nations combat terrorist groups and terrorist nations? Well, there have been two responses. One is to respond with force against terrorists, and terrorist nations, and the other is pacifism. And history has shown that when a nation gives into terrorists, it only emboldens more terrorist activity. Winston Churchill pointed out that appeasement only whets the appetite for more. The prime minister prior to Winston Churchill, Chamberlain, conceded to Adolf Hitler and only emboldened Hitler and the Nazis to more aggression. It was not until Winston Churchill finally stood his ground that Hitler finally paid attention, and we thankfully saw eventually the United States get involved in the end to the Nazi Empire here. In this particular situation, Hamas is determined to destroy Israel. Their goal is clearly stated in their motto, from the river to the sea, stating that they want the entire area of Palestine to be an Islamic theocracy. They will not settle for anything less than the destruction of Israel and eradicating the Jews from the land. And the method to accomplish this is not negotiation, but jihad, or military action. For example, just read the Hamas covenant, Article 13. This is just one section of the Hamas covenant. Well, if you read the covenant regarding peaceful solutions, diplomatic initiatives, and international conferences, this is what Article 13 states, and this is just a small part of Article 13. Diplomatic initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions of international conferences to find a solution to the Palestinian problem, contradict the Islamic resistance movement's ideological position. Giving up any part whatsoever of the land of Palestine is like ignoring a part of the Muslim faith. They go on to state, there's no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. The Palestinian people know better than to consent to having their future rights and fate toyed with. And in the last part I'll read, it says, there's no solution to the Palestinian problem except jihad. Regarding the international initiatives, suggestions, and conferences, they're an empty waste of time and complete nonsense. So here, Hamas doesn't see negotiation as an option. The only thing they will accept is the removal of the Jews from the land of Israel. They do not want a two-state solution here. Their only position is complete removal of the Jews from the land of Israel, not a two-state solution, and they are willing to accomplish this through jihad. And so really the only way to deal with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorist organizations like this really is by force. Force must be used against such organizations. Giving in to their demands only emboldens them to more military activity. Now, we must answer the question, what is a terrorist? A criminal or a foreign enemy of the government? Well, criminals threaten the state from within. Foreign armies threaten the state from the outside. Romans 13 states that governments are responsible to promote justice and to stand against evil. And evildoers should be afraid of governments. So when terrorists attack a nation, they should not be considered criminals, but foreign combatants. And in this case, we do not bring them to justice. We have to bring justice to them. It's highly unlikely that you could they do not have the rights of citizens of the state. They are foreign combatants here. And it's not likely you're going to be able to bring them into court and try them. You're going to have to bring justice to them. Military force and strategy then should be used to hunt down and capture terrorists. What about dealing with countries that host terrorists? Well, diplomacy must be used so that one can work within host countries to root out terrorist organizations. So diplomats must make two things clear to the nations that harbor terrorists. These nations must capture and punish terrorists as criminals. or they should extradite them and have them tried in an international court of law. When governments fail to execute justice or are powerless to do so, then they leave themselves open to the consequences of allowing a hostile foreign military force to come in the borders of that nation. And in the Old Testament, God allowed even Israel, even ordered Israel to attack nations that threatened or attacked God's people or the nation of Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, David was ordered by the Lord to defeat the Philistines who had killed King Saul and his sons and was threatening to attack the nation of Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 14, we see this phrase, "And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went." God blessed David in his battles against the enemies of Israel here. So in dealing with terrorists and nations that host terrorists, often you're going to have to bring justice to them. And often to establish peace, you're going to have to completely defeat and wipe out that terrorist organization to bring peace back to the land. And that's seems to be the goal of Israel here, is to not wipe out the Palestinian people or to destroy the land of Gaza. Their intent is to wipe out Hamas and restore peace to the land. We see that Hamas has been a force of evil. They do not seek peaceful means or negotiations. And so the only way to eliminate that threat, unfortunately then, is through military action to completely wipe out the leadership. And eventually you're going to have to defeat the ideology of this kind of movement, or else you'll get other cells and other groups popping up in different places, or other groups that have similar ideologies to strengthen themselves and to come to the forefront after Hamas is defeated and hopefully wiped out. So the ideology must also be defeated as well. Well, I hope this video helped you understand the difference between terrorism and just war. And in a fallen world where there is evil and wicked regimes threatening nations, the use of force is justified by governments when it is used in defensive measures to defeat terrorism and execute justice. When we follow biblical guidelines, then we're justified in our use of force. Well, I hope that helped you understand the difference between terrorism and a just war. And I hope this helped bring clarity to the Israel and Hamas conflict as we look at this not just through a geopolitical lens, but through the framework of the Bible. Thanks for being with us. I hope this series has been helpful to you in helping understand how biblical principles apply to all areas of life, and especially in this area of the use of force, when it is justified and when it is not. Well, thanks for being with us. I look forward to seeing you again here on Evidence and Answers.